lot of these crimes would not have been committed if there had been interventions earlier on, right? Like a lot of these crimes, people will do something to their wives and then they're not stopped and then they wind up killing their wives. But talk about the actual system, like how much the entire system is actively involved in either the smuggling itself, the taking of drugs, the murder, and the cover up. Like how involved are the special forces as a whole involved in the scandal and also the higher up elites?
There's multiple layers at which you could cut it. If you cut it at the highest level of US government, you could say that the White House, the State Department, the CIA, the Pentagon, and USAID all openly funded, armed, and protected the biggest drug cartel in world history in Afghanistan for 20 years and caused the entire planet to be flooded with cheap and potent heroin as a result of policy choices that were deliberately made under President Obama and under President Trump, and also under President George W. Bush, to initially partner with all of these drug traffickers who we stood up in Afghanistan and made the government of Afghanistan out of this collection of narco warlords, and to allow them to grow poppy unimpeded, to allow it to flourish to such an extraordinary degree, to the point where there has never been a narco state on par with Afghanistan. This was explicit U.S. policy, or not explicit in the sense that it was stated, but in the sense that it was out in the open. For the most part, they never talked about it, and just counted on the media to lie to you and tell you it's the Taliban, because that's how little they respect your intelligence. They can just tell you the opposite of the truth and expect that, the New York Times and other leading newspapers to just simply repeat it. Although there were, from time to time, there was reporting on the complicity of the U.S. client state, but it was always very muddled. No one ever just came out and said it, that the U.S.-backed government in Afghanistan was a giant drug cartel. I mean, look at what they're trying to say now about Maduro in Venezuela. I mean,
which we'll get
what an
to.
absolute joke for them to say that that's what they call a cartel. Venezuela, this country that produces virtually no drugs, that has tons and tons of oil, but is not a drug producing country, and there's almost no evidence that Maduro or his government are involved in, except the statement of a paid DEA informant and some other crappy low-level intelligence that they throw out. I mean, contrast that with what was going on in Afghanistan for 20 years, where Ahmed Wali Karzai, the president's half-brother, literally controlling the biggest opium market in the entire world in Kandahar. Just all of the drugs that were produced in the Helmand Valley going through there, all the money traceable easily to Hamid Karzai's government, drug flows from Dubai and stuff. We knew all of this. It was all out in the open. So the people who claim that Maduro is a cartel or the leader of a cartel, these are not serious people. These are just propagandists. And for the most part, they don't have a good grasp of the facts, and also are ignorant of the ways that the world actually works. So that's one thing, but if you cut it in the sort of, one thing I never allege is that the special forces as a military organization is dedicated to trafficking narcotics around the world. That's not happening.
Right.
And that wouldn't even make any sense. Why would they be doing that? People traffic drugs to make money. And what are the special forces don't need any money. They get all the money that they want from the government. But then if you cut it at a third and lowest level, at the level of enlisted operators in units like Delta Force or in the Green Berets, it is definitely a thing. Trafficking drugs is definitely a thing among those guys. How many of them are involved in it, it's hard to say, but I document case after case in my book, enough where I can say that, again, this is a thing that a lot of these guys do.
So we're going to get into Venezuela because it's very relevant, obviously, to what's happening right now. Also, you just mentioned Afghanistan, and, it's such an amazing contrast. And I think it's kind of like a controlled experiment to see the way that the U.S. Reacts to Afghanistan versus Venezuela. Makes it very clear it's not about drug production. But you talk about the drug trade in Afghanistan and the involvement of the Delta team and other forces. You say the Afghan client state had functioned as the world's biggest drug cartel, responsible for producing at least 4/5 and more like 9/10 of all the heroin consumed during the global opioid epidemic. Facing a certain wipeout by advancing Taliban, the infamous NATO protectorate which was also deeply inculpated in child sex trafficking and roundly despised by the Afghan people, fell to pieces and dispersed. So can you elaborate on that, please?
I mean, I didn't even have time to get into the child sex trafficking in the book, but that's almost worse in some ways. Like
Yeah,
this is another thing that was openly tolerated by the United States,
it's
and
disgusting.
it's, I mean, even worse than allowing them to pump heroin into our country and all over the world. You know, the bacha bazi is what it's called, or boy play. Another thing that we're falsely told is like just part of Afghan culture. It's not. And the Taliban, importantly, are totally opposed to this. And in fact, the Taliban's popularity in the 1990s first derived from the fact that they suppressed this practice, which, as far as I can tell, has no long term basis in Afghanistan. I've read accounts from Afghan journalists who know what they're talking about, who say this is not part of our culture. What it is closely identified with are the warlords that the CIA funded and armed in the 1980s to fight the Soviet Union. Those guys were the ones who first made it a thing to collect prepubescent dancing boys, trade them with other men, and systematically rape them and keep them on their bases in chains, these children. And they continued to do this during the entirety of the US occupation, when they were getting all their money and all their weapons from the United States, their political protection from the United States, air support from the United States, keeping child sex slaves on the bases that created by this military partnership with the United States. And the US knew about it the entire time, and not only did nothing to stop it, but also explicitly ordered US forces to not interfere in the rape of children that took place on US bases. There's a seminal New York Times article about Captain, I believe his last name, I don't want to get it wrong, so I won't say it. He's a special forces captain who came across a police commander with a little prepubescent boy, a child, chained to his bed, and was so outraged by this that he beat the stuffing out of this Afghan commander. He was relieved of duty and discharged from the military and disciplined. And it is, again, specific US policy communicated from the command. There's also a documentary, maybe DW, I think, documentary on this, that interviews lots of NATO officers who all attest to this appalling fact that the US military specifically ordered troops to turn a blind eye to the rape of children carried out by their Afghan allies on US bases. And 1 month before the US withdrew from Afghanistan, the State Department finally issued a report saying, oh, yeah, we're against this. We don't like this. This is bad. So I only devote like 2 sentences to that in
Right.
my book, but this is another topic that, yeah, bears investigation.
So a soldier was punished for killing the person who had the child chained to his bed.
He didn't kill him. He beat him
Oh, for beating
severely.
him up, right, beating
Yeah.
him up, yeah. But
Yeah, he was.
nothing was done to the person who had the child chained to his bed?
No, that commander, I'm not sure what became of him, but I believe that he remained an important U.S. ally. He was a DW goes and interviews this guy. These are not only narcos. This is why I have to only ridicule these claims about Maduro, because
Right.
the Afghans we worked with were not only big time narcos, but they were rapists in this sense. So DW interviewed, I believe it was the same people around the same commander, and they even had an audience with, I believe it was the same commander. If it wasn't the same one, it doesn't really matter too much because they're similar in this regard. But the guy's making jokes and laughing about it, doing opium, smoking opium right in front of the camera crew. This is the democracy that we created in Afghanistan at a cost to US taxpayers, I might add, of $1 trillion.
So explain why the West was so intent on not disrupting, basically. I'm not saying that they were like part of this child rape ring. I'm not saying that. But why did they not do something about it? Why did they so systemically turn a blind eye to it? Is that a fair way of describing it?
Hmm. For the same reason that they turned a blind eye to all the drugs. They had invested their political capital in this war, which, by the way, the reporting around this is so disingenuous that it almost makes me angry. I recently read a book by John Lee Anderson, To Lose a War, The Rise and Fall of the Taliban. And he writes at the beginning of the book that the Taliban refused to turn over Osama bin Laden after 9/11. And that's what precipitated the war. Now, I don't know John Lee Anderson, but I know for a fact that he knows damn well that the Taliban offered to turn over Osama bin Laden to a third country for processing judicially by the United States, and that they just use this weaselly terminology, even 20 years later, still lying about it because the mistake was so consequential that they decided to not only go to war with Osama bin Laden, but also to go to war with the Taliban and treat the Taliban, which is totally different, is not a terrorist organization, to treat them as the same as Al Qaeda, and to double down on that decision year after year for 20 years. And none of them had the political courage to backtrack, even though they kept losing more and more ground because the allies that they were able to get were bad people that the Afghan people hated. You can tell them, we're doing this for your good. We're doing this because you need to let girls go to school. We're doing this for democracy. But they just weren't up for that. You can't control other countries' destinies like that. And all they could do was just keep this puppet government in place and tolerate all its abuses, no matter how putrid they became.
Yeah, that was something that was really shocking to me. I mean, it's not that you're writing a manifesto in defense of the Taliban, but I knew that the U.S. allies in Afghanistan who replaced the Taliban were corrupt. I knew there was tons of corruption. I knew there was drugs. I didn't know about this other element about it, though.